Okay, this is it. I know some of you have been waiting for this, and here it is. We're going to begin walking through C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles. And let's begin with the epigraph. Now, this is read so well in the audiobook version, I want to just let it run, and then we'll talk about it briefly, then we'll start on the book.
Among the hills a meteorite lies huge, and moss has overgrown, and wind and rain with touches light made soft the contours of the stone. Thus easily can earth digest a cinder of sidereal fire, and make her translunary guest the native of an English shire. Nor is it strange these wanderers find in her lap their fitting place, for every particle that's hers came at the first from outer space. All that is earth has once been sky, down from the sun of old she came, or from some star that travelled by too close to his entangling flame. Hence, if belated drops yet fall from heaven, on these her plastic power still works as once it worked on all the glad rush of the golden shower. C.S.L. Reprinted by permission of Time and Tide.
Now, if you read the whole book, Miracles, the epigraph is perfect. If you've never read the book Miracles, you read this thing and say, what on earth does this poem mean? Now, a couple out there has been sending me their poetry, and it's been delightful. Poetry has fallen on hard times, but I'll just leave the epigraph where it is. And let's begin. The book has 17 chapters and an appendix, and a little bit about the author and some of these things. I have various different, as you can probably see, I have a weakness for books, and the weakness only gets worse when you have electronic versions. So I've probably got way too many copies of this book. So I'm going to probably use the Kindle sometimes, and I'll probably switch over to the Logos version sometimes, depending on what seems to go the best. Let's begin with the scope of the book.
1. The scope of this book. Those who wish to succeed must ask the right preliminary questions. Aristotle, Metaphysics 2:3:1. In all my life, I have met only one person who claims to have seen a ghost. And the interesting thing about the story is that that person disbelieved in the immortal soul before she saw the ghost, and still disbelieves after seeing it. She says that what she saw must have been an illusion or a trick of the nerves, and obviously she may be right. Seeing is not believing. For this reason, the question whether miracles occur can never be answered simply by experience. Every event which might claim to be a miracle is, in the last resort, something presented to our senses, something seen, heard, touched, smelled, or tasted. And our senses are infallible.
Our senses are not infallible. And this is where readers of audiobooks are themselves fallible. Our senses are not. The audiobook says our senses are fallible. The real book says our senses are not infallible. Not infallible is clearly the correct one. But I want to talk about this ghost business, because it's very interesting that Lewis begins with the comment about knowing a person. The only person that he's ever known who has claimed to see a ghost does not believe in the immortality of the soul. Okay, so what is the ghost? And he goes on to make the point that our beliefs are sticky. We believe things or we disbelieve things based on a lot of where we are. There's confirmation bias. We resist certain ideas. This is part and parcel of what it means to be a believing person. And he notes here that people will believe or disbelieve things not necessarily based on evidence. Now, this is part of the reason I talked about Lockean evidentialism. That is a part of this. We can't, in fact, have this conversation without a certain degree of evidentialism around, because evidentialism is such a common tool that it's part of the way that we can have conversations together. And it's also interesting that that Lewis could have used a lot of different things to illustrate this, but he uses a ghost. Why? Well, Ghosts are a very interesting phenomenon, which is nearly universal in human societies. Ghosts are an area that doesn't tend to get treated by Christian theology, which is very interesting. Ghosts are also something that Jung wanted to talk about with his classmates, and his classmates didn't want to talk about it, which I mentioned in a previous video. What's our deal with ghosts? On one hand, we're tremendously fascinated by them. On the other, we're tremendously embarrassed by them. Can you find ghosts in the Bible? Samuel at the witch, brought up by the witch of Endor. Was he a ghost? Peter, when he's knocking at the door after the angel releases him from prison in the book of Acts. And the woman who goes to open the door thinks it's Peter's angel. One of the fun things about ghosts with respect to Christian theology is it doesn't fit very easily into Christians, at least contemporary Christian frameworks. What are we to think about ghosts? Generally speaking, Christianity asserts that, when someone passes, they go to be with the Lord. Well, ghosts are generally imagined to be human beings that are lingering for some reason. Well, why are they lingering, and why them? And I think part of the reason Lewis picks on this for an illustration is because it's, in a sense, a fair illustration in between Christians and non-Christians. And Lewis had a tremendous amount of experience talking about these kinds of things with a broad range of people. And neither side has a good answer for it. Because if you're a materialist, well, what is a ghost? Well, you can't answer that question. You might say, well, a ghost is an illusion, or a ghost is a product of our mind. I was having a conversation with someone who knows a lot more about Jung than I do, and he was mentioning what I suspected of Jung, and this person wasn't an expert in Jung either, but that Jung seemed to have believed in a spiritual realm. Jordan Peterson, I think, is an agnostic with respect to a spiritual realm. Now we're into all kinds of fine delineations. I think Peterson is not ready to admit a spiritual realm. In that sense, he's not a full Jungian. He's on the spectrum a little closer to the materialists. He's been talking lately about where metaphysics meet. So he's playing with those ideas, and he says he needs another 3 years to figure out what the resurrection is. All right, I'll give you your 3 years. But after 3 years, I want an answer. But ghosts here occupy a space that, in a sense, Christians and materialists and a bunch of other people can kind of come in between. Because let's say you're a spiritualist and you say, well, okay, yeah, ghosts are deceased persons. Okay, well, why are they lingering seemingly to their torment and not out of their joy? If you concede that point, you have to concede, unlike many spiritualists today, who like to imagine that the spiritual realm is without its dangers, which is an idea that many who are spiritual but not religious and wandering over into New Age type thinking, which I always find surprising, because I'd say, if you're really interested in digging up the spiritualities of long dead people, you should pay enough attention to the fact that over the course of human history, almost every culture that had healthy, that had regular engagement with what we can only describe as a spiritual world, most of those cultures had a high degree of fear and a great degree of respect because they understood that there was evil in it. There's an interesting book I read by Hampton Sides, which is the story of Kit Carson, and Hampton goes into quite a bit of the background beliefs of the Diné, the Navajo, and many indigenous peoples around the world lived in mortal terror of spirits. Now that always, when I look at people more on the New Age spectrum who are, loving the spirit world that think it's like Disneyland, I think, well, how much can you really know if, in fact, people who actually lived submersed in these cultures lived in terror of spirits, and now you're not afraid? Why? That either, number one, makes me suspect that you don't really know a lot about spirits, is that you're playing some psychological games, or number two, that the spirits are doing something duplicitous or deceptive on you, and that should make you really scared. So Lewis begins the conversation about natural versus supernatural, and he begins it with ghosts. And he uses that because ghosts are a universal enough experience that almost any of us can come to, really without too much baggage in the fight. And because I would love to hear in the comment section how many atheists and agnostics, what atheists and agnostics think of ghosts. Just put it in the comment section. I'd really love to know. Why is it that ghosts continue to fascinate to the degree that cable television seems to have, produce an endless stream of ghost hunting? And YouTube has plenty of videos where people are looking for ghosts. Now, it's also important to remember that if you read C.S. Lewis biographies, so C.S. Lewis was, at a very early age, after his mother died, sent to English public school. Now, that's different from American public school. Basically, these were boarding schools. And Lewis, if you read Surprised by Joy, describes these boarding schools in terms of concentration camps. The first boarding school he went to, the boarding school was closed because the director was, basically described as insane and for abusing the children. He then became a priest, in which he was kicked out of that for similar reasons. The guy was a horrible man, and this is what C.S. Lewis was subjected to. But at one of these places, so you had, of course, the schoolmaster, who was often a man, but you'd also have kind of a mother figure in the dorm. Well, at this point in his life, C.S. Lewis was giving up his Christian faith. He was rejecting it. C.S. Lewis was, as he described later, on one hand declaring that God isn't real, and on the other hand, terribly angry at him, which I've met a fair number of people in that situation too, and I'm usually a little too gentle to say, how can you be angry with someone that you believe doesn't exist? I mean, you should probably find a good therapist for that. So, but one of the women who was taking care of Lewis at this point was a spiritualist. And, when we look at the time period that Jung lived, and if you read, end of the 19th century and early 20th century history, Spiritism was a very big deal in the English-speaking world. And there was a great fascination with the occult. And I wonder, I don't know enough about Jung, I wonder to the degree that this fascination, this Spiritism, impacted Jung. It impacted many, many writers and authors of that day, just as Darwin's thought impacted many of that time, and some other elements of Darwin's thought that today we would label as simply racist. So these are the waters that educated people are swimming in, and this is something that C.S. Lewis was given early. And so there's debate in the C.S. Lewis scholarly community about the degree to which this impacted him. But again, it's interesting that he begins the conversation here with a ghost. And interesting. Well, let's take a look at a little bit more.
If anything extraordinary seems to have happened, we can always say that we have been the victims of an illusion. If we hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural, this is what we always shall say. What we learn from experience depends on the kind of philosophy we bring to experience. It is therefore useless to appeal to experience before we have settled, as well as we can, the philosophical question. If immediate experience cannot prove or disprove the miraculous, still less can history do so. Many people think one can decide whether a miracle occurred in the past by examining the evidence according to the ordinary rules of historical inquiry. But the ordinary rules cannot be worked until we have decided whether miracles are possible, and if so, how probable they are. For if they are impossible, then no amount of historical evidence will convince us. If they are possible, but immensely improbable, then only mathematically demonstrative evidence will convince us. And since history never provides that degree of evidence for any event, history can never convince us that a miracle occurred. If, on the other hand, miracles are not intrinsically improbable, then the existing evidence will be sufficient to convince us that quite a number of miracles have occurred. The result of our historical inquiries thus depends on the philosophical views which we have been holding before we even begin to look at the evidence. This philosophical question must therefore come first.
So in other words, people often say, well, I think Lewis, here's the difficulty of this project of mine. I can rarely say anything better than Lewis has said. What in a sense I'm going to be doing is slowing us down, because even after, I don't know, this is the 6th or 7th time I've gone through this book. Each time I go through it, I see more. I understand him better, and this is what great writing and great works do. Now, this, you could very much argue that this is because of my own lack of mental ability, and fair enough. I'm not going to defend myself on that. I'm not the smartest man who's in the world, and I'm certainly no smarter. I'm definitely not smarter than C.S. Lewis, or even as smart as he was. But his argument here is that the people bring to this conversation what they have and their biases, and so seeing miracles won't change things. Now this is interesting, because sometimes they do, but the major point to be made here is that it's not about seeing, and we're not going to be able to answer this question in terms of history. Now, I don't want to dismiss the arguments about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but this Lewis's point here, in a sense, is part of the reason why I don't tend to listen to certain kinds of apologetics, because certain kinds of apologetics tend to major in bringing evidence to people, and I don't think any amount of evidence can convince someone who doesn't want to be convinced. And I think we see this in the political realm. I think we see this in the scientific realm. Believing something is a human thing, and what that means is it is subject to all of the other kinds of things that humanity is subjected to, and that's why even the existence of something we may call a proof never really fulfills the form of what we imagine proof to be. And so often in debates about these kinds of things, people say, well, yeah, but you can't prove that. Well, that's exactly right. I can't prove a whole range of things to a whole lot of people. There will always be climate change skeptics. There will always be creation science people. There will always be flat earth persons. If with enough human beings, you're going to find people that believe just about anything and everything. In other words, when it comes to human beings, proofs don't work. And this brings us to the question of why Lewis is writing this book at all with respect to miracles. And once we get into the question of natural versus supernatural, and that entire frame, which is itself a very late development in terms of cultural philosophy, miracles are the kind of watershed. They're the kind of Rubicon. They're the kind of thing that is a deal breaker. It's a shibboleth. For example, if one miracle occurs, one true miracle, and this is the point behind the Amazing Randy, and in the past he was doing these $1 million challenges. He was saying, if you can satisfy me that a miracle has occurred, and the Amazing Randy seemed like a fairly fair guy, If you can satisfy me, I'll pay you $1 million if you can demonstrate a miracle to me, even only one. And the point to be gathered from this is that if you are a materialist, you must abandon your worldview in the face of one miracle, which is exactly why Lewis's point about a ghost makes so much sense. Because if you have to abandon your worldview because of something, you are probably going to find a way to reject the thing. And so when you get into almost any debate with Christians, whether it is whether women should be priests, or whether women can serve as pastors, or whether gay marriage should be regarded with equal legitimacy as heterosexual marriage, whether Joseph Smith found golden tablets in New York and translated them with seeing stones. If you hold a worldview, and I think Peterson does this well, you are buffered and nested in an entire thing that's going to hold you right there. And this is the same in a sense with addiction. And I think this is part of the reason that many have noted that, one of the things that can break addicts from addiction are religious conversions. Why? Because religious conversions are the kinds of things that, they're like explosions in the movies or on Mythbusters. It's like this shockwave that just flattens everything out. That's in a sense what a religious conversion is. We are changed. There's a great story about St. Augustine now. St. Augustine, before he was St. Augustine, enjoyed sex. Most of us men do, and Saint Augustine enjoyed sex with various people. And one of his favorite lovers, after his conversion, comes up to him, and this was a woman with which he had spent a lot of enjoyable time. I'll say it that way. She comes up to him and says, Augustine, and he's completely blowing her off. He doesn't even look at her. Augustine, it is I. And he turns to her and says, yeah, but it is not I. What do you mean by that? As I am no longer the person that you used to know. Well, what changed you? Conversion. Your entire worldview was knocked down. Well, this is why miracles, or even talking about ghosts, is a good place to start. Because if you're a materialist, once you break the boundary between natural and supernatural, something else has to give. And that's why earlier in my videos, with my triangle about Jordan Peterson, I talked about the fact that you've got materialists, you've got supernaturalists. That's one line. And where's Peterson? Well, some people have showed me the H3 interview that he did recently. And with the Prager interview, he said he's religious. Oh, okay. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, Jordan Peterson, this is where we're going to get into this area with Jordan Peterson and say, okay, you're an agnostic. You're leaving the door open. All right. But here's the thing about open doors. Stuff walks through. And what C.S. Lewis would say with respect to stuff walking through is that, someone who is determined to stay atheist had better be careful about what they read. That was C.S. Lewis's point. And it's, in a sense, the opposite point of what I say about Christians, is that if you want to stay a Christian, you had better find a church. You had better find a Christian community through which you will go through time. It's also the same point I made in the comment section this morning, that if you love a woman, in the moment you fall in love, with a woman or a man, depending on, I'm not going to go into that, but if you fall in love, you immediately desire in that moment to spend the rest of your life with that person. Okay, that's a desire you have in the moment. What's going to happen to that desire if you don't frame it with institutions, with discipline, with commitment, with all of these other things that make people people. If you fall in love, and in that moment you desire to spend the rest of your life with that person, well, you had better marry them. Why? Because there's going to be a moment when you look at that other person and your feeling of love will be long gone. In fact, that other person may be your enemy. Well, so where do you find truth? Where do you nail something in the ground? Well, that's in a sense what marriage and commitment is. When I was in seminary, I was unmarried at the time, and Lewis Smedes, you can look him up. He's another Christian Reformed scholar. He taught at Calvin College, and then he went on to teach at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. And if you want to find something fun, look at when he was on Sally Jesse Raphael. Lewis Smedes was a very, very interesting man. But he was retired at that point. He was giving Staub lectures at Calvin Seminary, and he gave lectures about commitment. And he made this point. He said, there is something uniquely human about commitment, because what you do when you make a commitment is you start traveling through time. Now, I connect this up with what Jordan Peterson has to say about, with the kind of consciousness we see expressed in the sacrifice, we discovered the future. In a sense, let's add C.S. Lewis, or not C.S. Lewis, but let's add Lou Smedes to that and say, when you learn to make commitments, you govern the future. And that's, in a sense, what marriage is. And that's what joining a church does. In a sense, you say, well, I believe in Jesus now, but will I believe in Jesus 5 years from now? I'm in love with Jesus now, and I wish to give my life to him. Well, here's the thing I would say. You're not going to be able to give your life to him unless you make a commitment. And that commitment, as in a marriage, is going to have to be to, well, in a marriage it's to one other person. In membership, it's to an institution, to an organization, to a group of people. And it's not at the same level as a marriage commitment, I don't think. But you're going to have to, in a sense, commit to the church. Because if you don't do that, you will be subject to all of the normal comings and goings, ups and downs of human desire. And so just as with sacrifice we discover the future, so also with commitment we begin to govern the future. I need a better clock for this kind of thing. I'm going to drop it there and pick it up. Yeah, so this is just the beginning of C.S. Lewis's Miracles.